Hi, welcome to Dig into China. I'm Dong Sheng. In early August, the International Monetary Fund released its 2024 assessment report on China. The IMF called on China to deploy one-off fiscal resources to complete and deliver pre-sold properties or compensate homebuyers, according to an annual review of the world's second-largest economy published on Friday, August 2nd. It put the cost at the equivalent of 5.5% of gross domestic product over 4 years. That would amount to almost $1 trillion based on last year's GDP, according to Bloomberg calculations. It's a solution that China all but rolled out in an official response included in the report. At the end of the report, there is an official written response from China to the IMF report, which includes the following passage. We believe that we should continue to apply market-based and the rule of law principles in completing and delivering these units, said Zhang Zhengxin, the IMF's executive director for China, who was elected to the fund by the government in Beijing. It would be inappropriate for the central government to directly provide fiscal support, as it could lead to expectation of future government bailout and therefore moral hazards, Zhang said. I believe every Chinese citizen should read this passage, especially those loyal to the Communist Party, to see how the government is shifting blame. Let's consider the facts and the reasons through the issue. How do unfinished buildings come about? You might say it's because developers ran off with the money. But did they fail to pay the land fees to the government before disappearing? It's unlikely, as acquiring land from the Chinese government requires full payment upfront to obtain the land certificate. This land's value usually makes up more than half of the total project cost. Generally, land costs account for about 50% of a real estate project's expenses, financing costs around 20%, and the construction costs between 10% and 20%. What remains is the developer's profit. With the developers gone, shouldn't the communist government, which took a significant portion of the project funds, step in to help finish the project? After all, the developer's departure is partly due to the government's failure to oversee the situation. You neglected your responsibilities and collect the most profit. Shouldn't you take some responsibility when the public faces the consequences? Observe how the Communist Party shamelessly deflects responsibility. This statement was made to the IMF and released in English. They likely understand that the few ordinary Chinese citizens will see this document, so they speak quite candidly. They explicitly argue that if the government starts using public funds to assist the people, it will set expectations for such aid and lead to moral hazard. Let me clarify what moral hazard means. It suggests that the Communist Party believes if people come to expect that the government will take responsibility for unfinished buildings, then some will recklessly build such projects and others will buy them indiscriminately. Everyone might try to exploit the government for their own benefit. In other words, builders might abandon projects without concern and buyers might purchase without hesitation or expecting the government to cover the losses. This would essentially lead to people using the government as a safety net, which the party finds unacceptable. This is how the party truly views the Chinese people. To be blunt, the Communist Party thinks that the Chinese citizens lack decency and morals, as some of the loyalists would say when they criticize us. The party actually looks down on the Chinese people. It sees itself as the true elite. At first, it might seem like the Communist Party has a valid argument, but remember, this is a tactic to presume guilt and divert attention. They are implying that because someone might take advantage in the future, they can sidestep responsibility for issues that have already occurred and for which they should be accountable right now. It's like in the old days when the Yellow River would flood and the emperor had to send the relief to the affected areas. Now, imagine if the emperor decided not to send any help, thinking that the government stepped in, people would start expecting aid and stop working or helping themselves, just relying on government handouts. So ask yourself, if an emperor had this kind of thinking a few hundred years ago, how long would he have stayed in power? Anyway, only an extremely irresponsible government would say something like that. Besides, the logic that someone might take advantage in the future doesn't make sense. How much does it actually cost to construct a building? What developer would spend a huge sum on land just to leave a project unfinished, hoping the Communist Party would cover the cost? And what citizen would purposely buy an unfinished property just because they think the government might step in to complete it? It's somewhat plausible to think that the local governments might misuse central government relief funds, which means the real moral hazard lies within the Communist Party's own bureaucracy. In truth, what the party is really worried about is that if they step in to finish these unfinished buildings today, the people might start expecting the government to provide financial aid and welfare in the future. The party is determined to prevent such expectations. Even though all government revenue comes from the people, they see that the money is their own, not the people's, and they don't want anyone thinking they are entitled to any of it. The reality is quite harsh. Let's delve into the Communist Party's official documents to uncover the raw truth. As we discussed earlier, this year the Communist Party issued 1 trillion yuan in long-term special government bonds. Out of this, 300 billion yuan is allocated for upgrading equipment and for trade-in programs to replace old consumer goods, with the primary aim to boosting domestic demand. Following the Politburo meeting at the end of July, both the State Council and the Central Bank took immediate action. The State Council released an opinion on promoting high-quality development of service consumption, emphasizing ways to encourage spending. Similarly, the central bank's work meeting for the second half of the year focused on shifting efforts towards improving people's livelihoods and stimulating consumption. Do you know how the State Council addressed the issue of boosting consumption last year? If we examine the documents, we see a contradiction. Last year, the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, responsible for policy formulation, issued a document similar to this year's, titled Notice on Measures to Restore and Expand Consumption. The document clearly outlines the need to grow the consumption cake by increasing people's disposable income and finding ways to boost residents' asset-based income. It suggests that residents should be able to earn money through investments like stocks and funds, thus turning their spending desire into actual spending power. I understand that this may seem amusing, particularly the notion of making money through stocks and funds, which might come across as an attempt to attract inexperienced investors, right? Last year's document did acknowledge that increasing people's income is crucial for boosting consumption, which shows that the State Council officials weren't entirely disconnected from reality. They understood that the handing out of 5 yuan coupons for Ferraris wouldn't solve anything. People without money can't boost their consumption. However, this year, they don't mention this at all. Instead, they focus solely on developing various industries, completely ignoring whether Chinese citizens are poorer and have less purchasing power compared to last year. Let's look at it from another angle. When the Communist Party suggested last year that increasing asset-based income and helping people earn through stocks and funds would boost consumption, was it genuinely about enhancing domestic demand and spending power? I don't think so. It seems their main goal was to attract people into the stock market and exploit inexperienced investors. So looking at it this way, it seems to confirm what I've been saying. the Communist Party has never genuinely cared about domestic demand. Last year, their focus on boosting consumption was really just a pretext to profit from the stock market and exploit investors. This year's document on boosting consumption appears to be little more than a token effort meant to make it look like they are addressing the issue without actually taking meaningful action. In my opinion, if the Communist Party genuinely wants to boost consumption, the central bank should quickly announce a reduction in existing mortgage rates. Despite the recent rates cut by the central bank, mortgage rates won't drop until January of next year. To really stimulate consumption in the second half of the year, it's essential to ease mortgage pressure sooner. If the central bank doesn't act on this, it would indicate a lack of genuine intent to boost consumption. Ultimately, it would just mean using the 300 billion yuan to artificially inflate GDP figures without really encouraging consumer spending. Recently, Professor Huang Yiping from Peking University, who serves on the central bank's monetary policy committee, publicly criticized the government's macroeconomic policies as too conservative and overly focused on investment at the expense of consumption. He argued that the government needs to change its approach and support consumption growth directly by giving money to the public. Without this, China risks falling into a low inflation trap. It's evident that the real barrier to boosting consumption isn't the central bank's monetary policy, but rather the highest decision-making level led by the Emperor Xi. As I mentioned earlier, the Emperor Xi resembles an ancient ruler who wouldn't even fund the disaster relief during a Yellow River flood. If he's unwilling to invest in disaster relief, how can we expect him to provide money for the public to spend on leisure and consumption? What I'm trying to highlight is that under the Communist Party, boosting domestic demand will always be just a slogan. Even though there may be some dissent within the central bank, its lack of independence is apparent. The real focus continues to be on investment rather than consumption, as clearly shown in the recent China Regional Financial Operations Report 2024 released by the central bank. Last year's credit allocation clearly demonstrates the priorities. In 2023, new medium and long-term loans to businesses in both domestic and foreign currencies totaled 13.5 trillion yuan. Out of this, 12.5 trillion yuan was directed towards the manufacturing sector, making a 32% increase from the previous year. High-tech manufacturing received 2.7 trillion yuan and a 34% rise, while small-tech enterprises secured 2.5 trillion yuan in loans, with 212,000 companies getting approval. In stark contrast, the residential consumption loans increased by only 1.8 trillion yuan, even less than what small tech companies received. For a country with 1.4 billion people, this gap speaks volumes. Despite the rhetoric about boosting consumption, the actual allocation of credit shows where the government's true priorities lie. The flow of money reveals that while slogans may abound, real financial support is heavily skewed towards investment rather than consumption. In summary, following the IMF's 2024 annual assessment report on China, which recommended boosting domestic demand and using central fiscal resources to address unfinished construction projects and reduce public burdens, the Communist Party's response was quite shocking. They clearly stated that they cannot allow the Chinese people to develop expectations of government assistance. They expressed a lack of trust in their citizens, arguing that such relief would only lead to moral hazard. This stance reveals a master-servant attitude towards the populace. The Communist Party has clearly indicated that Chinese citizens are viewed as their subordinates, and that the wealth and the taxes generated through their labor are treated as the party's own property with no claim allowed by the public. While they project an image of oppression internationally, domestically they portray themselves as benevolent leaders addressing the people's hardships, frequently reiterating slogans about boosting domestic demand. However, a closer examination shows that these are just repeated empty promises. In this world, money doesn't lie. While substantial credit flows into manufacturing and high-tech sectors, there's no move to ease the burden of housing loans for the public. The Emperor Xi's stinginess is clear. If it were 100 years ago, the communist rule might have been overthrown multiple times due to widespread discontent. Modern tools like big data and facial recognition have prevented such revolts from happening. Thank you so much for watching. If you find this video helpful, please like it, drop a comment below, and hit the subscribe button right here. It really helps YouTube suggest my videos to others. I'll be back with more content soon. Until then, stay well.